If you enjoy Earthshift podcast, you will love Lada's new book, Geopolitical and Geo-Economic Quantum Calibrations, the #1 new release in prophecies. Check it out on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Apple, and more. Connect with Lada and us on ladaray.com. Join our advanced community with over 400 in-depth articles at patreon.com/ladaray. Hello friends, welcome to Earthshift podcast, the enlightened truths about geopolitics, our past, present and future, and so much more. This is Lada Ray. We are finally getting to the juiciest bits about Ukraine. We have already discussed Ukrainian elections and who really won, Putin, Zelensky or Poroshenko. We discussed the Russian passports for the people of Donbass and Ukraine and how Putin yet again outplayed his adversaries. In this segment, we are talking about the Russian oil and coal sanctions against the Kiev regime and the end of Ukraine gas pipeline dream. This touches a lot of people, and not just in Ukraine and Russia, but also in Europe. It also touches Belarus directly. And so I want to discuss all this. And this is how it goes. First of all, as I said in previous episodes, Putin, being very careful, waited until the last second to start any sort of sanctions. And Russia was pushed towards that, those sanctions for the longest time. As a matter of fact, just before elections concluded in Ukraine and Zelensky was elected, Rada again passed a very anti-Russian law banning Russian language and anti-Russian sanctions as well. Basically, Russian sanctions are a response to the Ukrainian, to the Kiev Rada sanctions. We should really separate the people of Ukraine who are suffering and the clique that is in power currently, as well as oligarchs, as well as their foreign handlers. We really have to separate those two because a lot of people in Ukraine disagree with this, and they announced their disagreement through voting against Poroshenko and delivering such a crucial blow to him and his cronies. So what we have is that Russians waited till the last second. They wanted to see how Zelensky will show himself. And he started making all kinds of volatile and very anti-Russian statements before elections. I explained in the previous episodes why he did that. However, whatever he did actually gave this green light to Russia to go ahead with sanctions. And Russians did. So the sanctions concern oil and all kinds of refined oil products, including diesel that goes into the tanks and armored vehicles that attack and kill people in Donbass. So without all this, without all these lubricants, oils, gasoline, diesel, whatnot, without all this, they're unable to attack Donbass. So that alone serves as a good deterrent for the aggressive Kiev junta to war against people of Donbass. This is a very long overdue step. Basically, a lot of people were pushing Putin and the Russian government to take this step and ban oil products to Ukraine altogether. However, as I said, Putin and the government were waiting to see if the new elections will usher in a better leader. They sent all kinds of signals through meeting with Boyko. I wrote about this. Boyko was another candidate who is considered the most pro-Russian there. And apparently election results were very much falsified. He might have gotten a lot more. We are not going to stop at that, but there was definitely a falsification. So Boyko could have gotten into the second round against Zelensky, and who knows which one of them would have won as a result. So what we have right now is that Russia started these sanctions, and they concern, as I said, all products of all kinds, and they concern the coal and coal products. If somebody needs coal, say to heat up houses or something, or for consumer needs or industrial needs, they can actually contact and ask for special permission from the Russian government if they prove that what their coal or oil do not go towards killing people or towards creating a war and animosity in Ukraine. Not to mention a lot of the oligarchs and elites in Ukraine, they make tons of money on selling at much higher prices inside the country Russian coal and Russian oil, including oil products. So Poroshenko and his clique, everybody in the Rada, they're all complicit. They all became rich members of the government, all kinds of paramilitary structures, they all became rich on this, on all these schemes. One of the schemes that they invented was called Rotterdam Plus. And Rotterdam, as you know, is the city in Western Europe. And another one was called Düsseldorf Plus. One more time, Rotterdam Plus for oil and Düsseldorf Plus for coal. So they would take Russian coal or oil and say that, oh, this is not from Russia. We actually got it delivered from Western Europe. Therefore, it's more expensive. So they would take it in a roundabout way, such as coal ship would depart from Novorossiysk and go to Odessa and unload there and go back to Novorossiysk. But they will say that the coal actually came from Pennsylvania or South Africa. This way they deceived their populations and Ukro-Nazis into believing that they did not deal with Russia anymore, that they actually distanced themselves from any Russian products. Meanwhile, their purchases from Russia increased dramatically by 30% or more in the past year or two. This is because of these criminal schemes. These criminal schemes implied, in fact, that those who purchased it, because they said, well, in reality, the coal came from, from the other side of the planet. Therefore, it's more expensive. Same with oil. In reality, none of this happened. And so the difference they put in their pockets. Poroshenko and his cronies, everybody in the government, everybody in the Rada, everybody in the military and all kinds of power agencies such as like SBU and such stuff, they got rich off of these schemes. So this puts the end to both of these schemes that Russian FSB uncovered, and basically they turn the spigot on those, and none of this can be done in the future. Of course, they're furious about it. Again, as I said, by special permission, people can actually, if you really need for people's needs, the Russian government will probably ration you out a small quantity of oil or a small quantity of coal. Here we get to another side of the story, the Belarus involvement, which is very unsightly. Lukashenko himself and his family, as a lot of Russian investigations, official investigations, not just somebody on the side investigating, official investigations confirmed that his family and Lukashenko himself got very rich off of similar schemes. What they do, Russia supplies at very low prices, very friendly, brotherly prices, both primarily oil to Belarus, a little bit of coal as well, but primarily oil. What Soviet Union did was build refineries for Russian oil, for Soviet oil, let's just say, on Belarus territory. The reason being the best buyer of Russian oil products were in fact Western European countries or Central European countries. So the pipeline from such and such oil depository in Siberia or somewhere in northern Russia goes all the way to Belarus. The pipeline is called Druzhba. Druzhba means friendship. And this pipeline, actually, the oil is taken out of pipeline. It goes into the factories, refineries that make products out of this oil. And then the refined oil, the final product, goes to Western Europe or to Southern Europe or to Central Europe or Northern Europe, whatnot. So Belarus gained all this rich inheritance from the Soviet Union. It was the Soviet Union that built it, primarily Russia, because Russia was the largest country of the Soviet Union, within the Soviet Union, and Russia contributed the most to other smaller republics, poorer republics, actually robbing itself of a lot of its riches. So they kept those refineries, and now Russia continues pumping oil at very low, extremely low discounted prices, which nobody else can get in the world anywhere else. And this is how Belarus economy stays not only alive, but also it flourished for a while. They then refine the oil, create various oil products, lubricants, gasoline, diesel, whatnot, and then they sell it to other parties and they pocket the profit. parts of the oil goes directly to Central and Western Europe without refining, but it's both processes are happening at the same time. So what happens next is that Belarus sells a lot of its oil products to Ukraine, and the investigation showed that a lot of these products, especially diesel, lubricants and such, they actually go to work for tanks and armored vehicles and jets, etc., that then go and attack Donbass and kill people there. Russians have been saying for years that Belarus should stop selling these things to Ukraine that allow them to perpetrate aggression against Donbass, and Belarus has not listened. In fact, Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, has been throwing tantrums and threatening Russia, actually trying to blackmail Russia, such as they will close down the Druzhba pipeline and oil will not be able to flow. And in fact, they almost did that. And Russians had to play like a softball with them. Now, finally, Russians put the foot down and said, we are only giving Belarus the amount of oil that they need for their own industry. And they have to prove to us that they, in fact, when they refine that oil, they send it to other countries than Ukraine. Once that happened, of course, it's like you stepped on the cat's tail, that the cat starts meowing, meow, meow, meow. These are the kinds of sounds that were coming out of Belarus as a result of Russians putting the end to this illegal, what is not authorized by Russia, of transfer of energy to Ukraine, which allowed Ukraine, meaning Kiev regime, of course, in this case, to attack Donbass and perpetuate all kinds of atrocities against its own people. And then various unpleasantries started with Belarus. The latest is, I've been asked to weigh in on this situation. Supposedly, a oil that was contaminated was sent through the Druzhba pipeline, and it ended up in Belarus facilities, and then a large batch of oil has been considered as spoiled. Unusable, in fact. Well, it turned out that somebody sabotaged that oil. They said that investigation by Russia is ongoing, and Putin got involved personally in this. But basically, this is a true sabotage. Something like chlorine gas or something like that was pumped into the oil, and that small batch of oil contaminated other batches of oil, and then various products that were made out of that oil. And so this basically stopped the functioning of the Druzhba pipeline. Lukashenko seized on that and said, aha, and now I'm going to reconsider our relationship and how we transit oil through Belarus. Russia is supplying us with bad oil. Basically, he is again throwing tantrums. He is trying to get some sort of preferences from Russia. It is not a very nice situation. The signals that Lukashenko and Belarus is traying off and trying to create a mini Ukraine on its territory, sort of like not exactly Ukro-Nazi Ukraine, but something more nationalistic and something more anti-Russian. These signals have been arriving for years. Some of these are very alarming because Belarusians are really, really close to Russians. And this nationalistic streak, it is the sign of times. Yes, this is period 8, as I explained to those who listened to my webinar 4. I'm going to put the link underneath this. And go and listen. It's on ladare.com. Go to webinars. It's webinar 4, period 8 predictions. This is the time of nationalism right now. And we have to deal with it when everybody redefines their sovereignty, their identity, their national identity. But also it is the time for unionizing, for getting together with others. Well, it's the time when countries and organizations break up and new countries, organizations and new unions take place. Well, in Lukashenko's case, he is getting a little bit senile. He is getting a little bit too old and paranoid. And so with him, it's getting harder and harder to deal. He also complains more and more. As I said, I described all this in great detail. Excellent posts I have, chapters I have as part of my new book, Geopolitical and Geo-Economic Quantum Calibrations, with calibrations of Poroshenko that prove that Poroshenko is not what he seems or not what some people think he is, in fact, and also he's getting old and his situation worsens. He's worried about the economic situation of Belarus more and more, and debts coming due, and more debts are accumulated. But Russia is trying, as usual, for Russia, the great balancer, is trying to keep the relationship even. But when he seriously oversteps boundaries, Russia has to give him like a slap on the wrist. And this is a slap on the wrist. So somebody sabotaged that oil in Samara, which is central Russia, on Volga, where that oil was stored for further piping through the pipeline, Druzhba pipeline, and then into the west, as well as to Belarus. I'm adding this piece later. The whole episode has been recorded, and then I found out some more information. So I wanted to insert it here so that we have a correct understanding of what happened with the contaminated oil from Samara and what happened with Belarus going forward. So first of all, Putin, his team, and Russian news has announced that, in fact, they found the culprits. And those culprits appear to be some group, criminal group, in fact, that operated near Samara oil storage facilities. They pumped chlorine-based gas to substitute for oil that they stole. And those culprits were apprehended. Names were actually named on national TV. However, I do have a slight problem with this official story because one thing really jumped at me. There are several culprits, and they say that they stole oil for $15,000. And that's all. Not much oil that has been stolen. So that, to me, that seems like an awfully low price for that elaborate scheme and contaminating that much oil, creating international scandal, etc., etc. So something in this story is not exactly what it seems, unless they were found out really quickly at the very beginning of the scheme. That's possible too. But I'm still thinking that there was sabotage that took place. And this is what I'm talking about in this podcast. My version of events is there was some sort of sabotage. So I'm going to let you listen to the rest of the podcast. I'm only going to mention one more thing. I'm not being overly alarmist about Belarus. Those who are observers like me of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, post-Soviet space, Europe, I observe the entire world, but this is one of my focuses, of course, having been from there and being an expert in that area. So I have been observing very strange actions by Belarusian President Lukashenko for the longest time, and I wrote about it repeatedly. I spoke about it in webinars and in various pieces on Future Chancast, on Patreon, in Earthshift reports, as a matter of fact, in webinars, as I mentioned, and also in the book. It is in my latest book. So those who follow all this with me are not surprised. The new thing by Lukashenko is that we just had Victory Day, and that's one of the biggest holidays, if not the biggest holidays of the year in Russia and all of post-Soviet space, even in Ukraine, where it is banned. In Kiev, Odessa, and many other cities and towns, there were Immortal Regiment marches. And that's despite everything being banned. In Kiev alone, people came out and marched. They said that that was the biggest march of the Immortal Regiment ever. And if you want to find out what that is, go to Futures Chancast. I have a number of posts, including the Immortal Regiment March, which gathered almost 1 million people, as usual, in Moscow. And this event is to commemorate the victims of the Great Patriotic War in Russian post-Soviet space, what is known elsewhere as World War II. So in Kiev alone, 20,000 people came out, and people say that the unofficial statistics is that throughout the day to the monument of the unknown soldier, throughout the day, at least 200,000 people came with flowers. Same is true for Odessa. You know, same numbers or even higher numbers are true for Odessa. Now, other cities did the same. So the reason I'm mentioning all this is that Lukashenko in Belarus, which suffered one of the worst during the Great Patriotic War, every fourth person in Belarus was killed during the war. Just think about it. Quarter of the population of Belarus. And it's a small republic. It's about only 9 million people. However, that's like mind-boggling numbers. Just think about it. If this happened to your country. So it's one of the worst hit by the war. It was the first hit by the Hitler Nazis. And Lukashenko banned Immortal Regiment, which is the tradition not only in Russia and Ukraine, despite all the bans, but also in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, where it's also banned. And where it's not banned is in Kyrgyzstan, and Azerbaijan, and Armenia, and heads of state, top politicians march with everybody else in immortal regiments somewhere in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Armenia, for that matter. The guy who is considered pro-West, Pashinyan, the new prime minister of Armenia, marched with his people in the Immortal Regiment March on May 9th in Armenia, in Yerevan. Meanwhile, Lukashenko forbade the Immortal Regiment March. They published everywhere in the news, on official sites, that it was cancelled to dissuade people from marching. That's how much he is afraid of his own people and large groups of people congregating. But that also speaks of this very unpleasant, very disturbing tendency of Belarus today. And Lukashenko, who used to be one of the most pro-Russian, to become more and more nationalistic, to become more and more confrontational and offstandish with Russia. So all this kind of like falls into the whole picture of what I'm painting about Belarus. And I'm not taking off the shelf version of events that there might have been sabotage of oil. Perhaps those people wanted to steal oil. That's possible, that they were criminals, but also saboteurs at the very same time. And now we will proceed with the rest of this episode. Russia announced the sanctions against Ukraine at that same time. Russia announced, or was getting ready to announce, sanctions. Russia announced that Belarus cannot pump oil and sell oil products to Ukraine liberally, that all this has to stop. This has been in the works for several months. This has been known for quite a while. So these two forces, whether the saboteurs come from Ukraine or from Belarus for that matter, hopefully not, because, everybody loves Belarusians. Russians love Belarusian people. Who knows what the clique in the government, what kind of games they're playing nowadays, because they're getting more and more worrying as far as their direction goes. So this is definitely a signal. This is definitely somebody who doesn't want Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus to be together as one people. Somebody who doesn't want all this to be resolved. Could be anybody. As I said, there are so many people who could be in on this. Now, the situation now is such that with this coal, oil, and other embargoes, Ukraine has to, basically the industry is very much impacted in Ukraine. The agriculture will be impacted. And who knows how much the heating season next winter will be impacted. Also note that Russians waited with this until the end of winter. They did not want to shock Ukraine with no oil and no coal in the winter, because a lot of power stations in Ukraine actually use coal. And also a lot of them use nuclear energy. And nuclear is also dependent on Russian equipment, because equipment from the West is not compatible, as well as the rods and the actual fuel for nuclear station also has to be according to Russian specifications, because Western are very different and they're not compatible. Well, of course, nobody will play with nuclear stations because that's awfully dangerous. So Russians will never do anything in that regard. In fact, they're trying to really cheat a nuclear energy industry in Ukraine with kid gloves and help as much as possible so that some wacko Ukrainazi doesn't blow up something or somebody doesn't sabotage it. It's a very big deal in Ukraine. It's very, very worrying that 4 major power stations, which are nuclear, are located in very suspect areas where anybody could sabotage anything. So back to coal and to oil. we are at the point when Russians just said that they will do it, but they didn't do it yet. And they said that the oil embargo and coal embargo start on June 1st. As I said again, they were waiting till summer so that not to negatively affect the poor people of Ukraine, who already are terribly suffering from the Kiev junta, from very low pensions, low salaries, from everything that is happening, from war in Donbass, etc., etc. So what we have now is that we're waiting for June 1st. And why June 1st? This also depends on inauguration by Zelensky, but it depends on his first steps as the president, what Rada will do, how many anti-Russian actions and hostile actions the government there will take before June 1st. All this is being recorded, remembered, and Russians still leave this last chance not to execute their right of banning oil and coal to Ukraine. See, that's why they gave this term, this like period for Ukrainians to cool off and maybe start acting more reasonably. But so far, there are no signs of that. Ukro-Nazis are way too strong in Ukraine, and they are threatening and pressuring, and they are hysterical, and they're very dangerous. They threaten everybody who does not toe the line they want them to toe. And as I pointed out previously, a lot of these Ukro-Nazis, in fact, some of them are descendants, and they lived in Canada somewhere or in the US, and now they came back for revenge against Russians because of their defeat in World War II when they sided with Hitler. Now I want to talk about the Ukrainian gas pipeline. This is, in my opinion, especially important. We will do a separate episode about the pipelines, the Nord Stream 2, TurkStream, the power of Siberia, which is going to China and possibly to South Korea and possibly also to Japan. Well, this is a mega project. I wrote a lot about this on Patreon. So join Lada Patreon and you will be able to read all the details, a lot of juicy stuff, great articles there. I wrote and spoke about it previously also. Also, one of my previous Shift podcasts was about this. It was about Nord Stream 2, etc. So refer to that. But today I want to talk about the end of the Ukraine gas pipeline. So as Russia builds those alternative pipelines, obviously Ukrainian gas pipeline is no more. Russian agreement with Ukraine, transit agreement that is, expires pretty soon. Merkel and Germany are trying to kind of like sit on two chairs and play this evasive game. On one hand, they want to take away all the transit from Ukraine. That's the truth of the matter. What is Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2? That's gradually transitioning the transit to Central and Western Europe out of the hands of Ukraine, which is so unpredictable. That's the truth of the matter. You know, this is the actual truth. That's what Germany is trying to do. Putin proposed it to them a while back. He pitched it that Germany will now become the hub for gas transit to Central and Northern and Western Europe. And of course, Germany jumped on it. So if they were truthful with themselves, they should say, yes, we want this transit, and Ukraine did not fulfill its obligations as a transitor. It was a very fickle, very unreliable transitor. It oftentimes lied to us and to Russia and stole gas out of the pipeline. So we now are going to create our own reality. But Merkel and her cronies and everybody there in the government and in the media, they in fact lie a lot. They are neocons or neoliberals or anything in between. They're globalists. They are, in fact, oftentimes American patsies. So they cannot say, even if it benefits their country directly and benefits entire Europe directly, they cannot say it as is. You know, I have an issue with Merkel. But Merkel has been leading a double life, in my opinion, since she was a child. Even when she was in GDR and when she traveled to Russia, when she was head of one of the young pioneer organizations in GDR, she was always leading double life. Her father was, that's my firm opinion about that family. So she continues doing the same thing. She tries sitting on two chairs at once. She's on her way out. But again, that was one of my big reports on Patreon. My members on Patreon enjoy reading these big in-depth reports where I explained why Merkel is still in her seat as a chancellor. Even though she already announced and everybody knows she's on the way out, she will stay there to oversee the completion of Nord Stream 2. But most of my predictions and my in-depth analysis of what's really happening with Germany, Nord Stream 2, etc., read on Lada Patreon. Join on any tier and you will get exposed to 400 articles and posts that are juicy and one of a kind, and you will not find them anywhere else. They are very exclusive to my Patreon members. Depending on your tier, you will get less or more posts. I mean, go and look at it and choose what is right for you. I will put a link in the description. Now, back to Ukraine. So Merkel is saying, oh, we still want some gas to go through Ukraine. But the reality is such that if you pump only a little bit of gas through a pipeline, which is designed to pump 100 million cubes or something, if you pump only 15 instead of 100, then what you get is you rust that pipeline. It slowly starts rusting and rotting and going into disrepair. In other words, use it or lose it. In this case, this is not going to work, and everybody knows it. So Merkel is awfully hypocritical, but she has to safeguard her ass, because in reality, if she says that, oh, no, Ukraine is no more, we're going to take it over, then the rest of the EU, her cronies, in fact, neoliberal, neocon cronies, all those globalists in power in the EU will crucify her. She knows it, and that's why she's protecting herself. Putin just shrugs his shoulders and says, sure, if they do their job as translators in Ukraine, if they fulfill their promises, if they stop giving us a hard time, if we find that they paid us properly, paid off their debts, then sure, we'll consider it. Why not? We'll pump some gas through Ukraine. Bottom line, now Russia gets all these alternatives, and TurkStream is nearing completion. Nord Stream is encountering all kinds of problems right now from Denmark. Denmark is trying to stop it. They're not giving permission. It's like a third round of negotiations. They're not allowing the pipeline to go in their waters close to their territory. It's within their continental waters. So what Russians and Germans are considering is actually laying the pipeline around the Danish territory, because you can go in the neutral waters where nobody can say a word. Well, this will extend the pipeline, so it's going to take a little longer. Plus, it's going to be a little more expensive, but it's doable. Basically, Russians are still gearing towards finishing the pipeline this year in December. At first, it was announced that it could be finished ahead of time. So Danish government is playing a role of a Trojan horse here, basically to appease Americans and to appease Brussels and those forces in the EU that are staunchly anti-Russian. But this will also be resolved. I mean, I don't see much of a problem here, so maybe it will take a tiny bit longer to build this pipeline. But Germans are rushing, really rushing, because they know that the Russian agreement with Ukraine is about to expire. It expires on January 1st of 2020. After that, Russians already said they will not renew that agreement. So this is the end of Ukrainian pipeline as we know it. And it used to pump up to 70-75% of the Russian oil going to Central and Western Europe. Meanwhile, Belarusian arm of the pipeline was much smaller, and it pumped some like 20-25%, maybe a little bit less. Now, less and less is being pumped through both Belarus and Ukraine. And Belarusian pipeline is still going to be functioning, even though Lukashenko is such a difficult person, as I was telling you previously in this episode, but it's still possible to work with them. Meanwhile, and incidentally, Lukashenko and the Belarus government are also extremely worried that Russians will eventually take away their pipeline contribution as well. Pipeline is old. It was built by the Soviet Union. Both Belarus and Ukraine do not invest in repairing those pipelines. They have been reaping the benefits. Russians pay billions for transit to both Belarus and Ukraine, but they are not investing into maintaining and repairing the pipelines. So as they become older, of course, it's becoming more and more difficult to justify pumping through those rusty pipelines. So you want to pump through new pipelines, hence Nord Stream, Nord Stream 2, and TurkStream. Also, Russians are developing their own LNG facilities very successfully. This is like in the Baltic. They took the transit of oil away from the Baltic states, who are extremely super Russophobic, so they don't want to rely on those, so they don't sabotage Russian business. And they built new terminal, a new port, and new LNG facility in Ust-Luga, which is on the Baltic on the Russian side. And that port is growing by leaps and bounds. A lot will be happening through that. So that's an alternative route for Russian gas. In other episodes, I will talk to you about the Arctic route, which is a super interesting thing. Arctic trade route, pipelines that run to the Asian countries, and my key prediction from 2014, that if Europeans do not play the game right and do not rush with securing Russian gas now for themselves, then Russian gas will go to Asia and to China. And then Europe will experience shortages. So those predictions apparently were heard by European governments, because that's when they started rushing building Nord Stream 2, then TurkStream, etc. And some governments in Central Europe, they are constantly meeting with Putin, and they get reassurance and they sign contracts well in advance, paying money well in advance to secure a part of the transit to their countries, those countries that do not have borders with Russia and do not have access to the pipelines directly. These are countries like Austria and Hungary and Czechia, and of course Serbia and other countries in the Balkans. Greece is in that category, Bulgaria. All these countries are turning around and are trying to get a piece of this big gas game. Even countries that are in the past that were somewhat controversial, such as Bosnia, even they are getting in on the game. They're trying to negotiate with Russia and Putin some piece of the pie, the Russian pie. So what is going to happen is that once 2020 rolls in, Ukrainian pipeline will be left to rust. Even if some gas is piped through it still in 2020 or after, it's going to be very minor, and little by little all this will end. Or something new will have to be built, or Ukraine will have to change its rhetoric. So all these things are, see, this is like a perfect storm that is generating through these 3 episodes about Ukraine, Russia, elections, Zelensky, Putin, what is happening, these new sanctions by Russia. What I'm trying to tell you is that things are changing. The perfect storm is gathering. And perfect storm in this case will be a very cleansing storm. It will be something very different from the past, when it was, the tide was against Russia and against Russian people in Ukraine. And as I said, these are Russian people, except some who forgot their roots or those who infiltrated from somewhere else. This perfect storm, the cleansing thunderstorm, will in fact create a different paradigm. It will happen. It will happen for Belarus as well. It will be a lot of maneuvering, this very delicate finessing, this chess games, this global geopolitical chess games that Putin is conducting on many boards at the same time. It will continue. But there are many hopeful signals here and there. Even if it feels a little dark or it feels confusing, this is the great door shift. As part of the great shift, Russia, the great balancer, will have to rebalance the world. All these things, the sabotage, the strange events that are happening, these adverse events, they are happening because the various dark forces don't want rebalancing. It's that simple. As Russia rebalances, also more people wake up, and more people in the West and more people all over the world actually start seeing the light. And eventually this will happen. It doesn't mean that everything, suddenly all the power will go to the East and will be drained from the West. Not at all. I'm not saying this, and I don't want this to happen. We want a balanced world. We want everybody to have their share, their opportunity. We want everybody to have their day in the sun, and everybody to work cooperatively. That's what we want. That's what highly calibrated people all over the world want. Enlightened people like us, people who are Lada Patreon members, those who are my subscribers, my followers. So again, check out my book, and you won't be sorry you did that. The book is excellent. I'm going to talk about my book some more in special episodes that I'm preparing, but I really wanted to share these things with you. You know, I'm preparing more geopolitical episodes, I'll be honest with you. One of them will be about the Russian pivot to Asia, Putin meeting with Kim Jong-un, and then also Putin and Xi Jinping, as well as Russian Arctic trade route. And that's a very interesting topic too. So I'll see what I can do, what I can put in these episodes, and what I actually have to discuss only with my exclusive members on Patreon. So join me on Patreon, and this way you won't miss anything.